Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she carefully unfolded the fragile letter, the crisp paper rustling in her trembling hands. The elegant handwriting was faded but legible, and with each line she read, a cold shiver ran down her spine. "My dearest Eleanor," it began, and Olivia's breath caught. Eleanor was her grandmother's name. She continued reading, her eyes widening as the words revealed an unexpected connection between her family and the Harringtons, one that had been kept hidden for decades. "I never meant for things to turn out this way. I loved you in ways I was never allowed to say, and I regret every moment we spent apart. But you must understand, the world would never accept us together. I was forced to make a choice, one I still regret to this day." Olivia's mind raced as she pieced together the implications. Was this letter proof of a forbidden love affair? Had her grandmother, a woman she had always admired for her strength and resilience, been involved with someone in this very household? She barely heard the distant sound of Mrs. Harrington's heels clicking down the hallway. Panic set in, and Olivia quickly stuffed the letter into her apron pocket, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew she had to get out of there before she was caught snooping. As she resumed cleaning, her thoughts were a whirlwind of emotions. She had spent years feeling like an outsider in this house, enduring Mrs. Harrington's disapproving glares and condescending remarks. But if this letter was true, if her grandmother had once been more than just a servant here, then Olivia had a deeper connection to this place than anyone had ever acknowledged. Later that evening, as she sat on the worn couch in her small apartment, Olivia carefully pulled the letter from her pocket and read it again under the dim glow of the lamp. The more she read, the more questions flooded her mind. Who had written this letter? And why had it been hidden away for so long? Determined to uncover the truth, Olivia knew she couldn't simply brush this aside. This was more than just a relic of the past. This was her family's history, tangled with the lives of the very people who had looked down on her for so long. Taking a deep breath, she resolved to dig deeper. She would search for more clues, ask questions, and confront the secrets that had been buried in the Harrington mansion for generations. Little did she know, the truth she was about to uncover would shake the entire household and force Mrs. Harrington to confront the past she had tried so hard to forget. As Olivia sat alone in her small, dimly lit apartment that evening, the weight of the letter pressed heavily on her chest. The elegant handwriting painted a vivid picture of a forbidden love affair that spanned decades, a romance between her grandmother, Eleanor, and Mr. Harrington's late father, Richard Harrington Sr. The words on the fragile paper spoke of a love that had defied societal expectations, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and regret. "I never stopped loving you, Eleanor. Even after I was forced to marry someone else, my heart always belonged to you. But the world we lived in would never have allowed it. Our love and our child had to remain in the shadows." Olivia's eyes widened as she traced the delicate script. A child? Could it be her mother? The dates lined up perfectly, and the possibility sent a shiver down her spine. Had her mother lived her entire life never knowing the truth about her father? Olivia's hands trembled as she realized that she, too, might be tied by blood to the powerful Harrington family, people who had treated her with nothing but cold indifference for years. Conflicted and overwhelmed, Olivia folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope, hiding it in her apron pocket. She couldn't act impulsively. Revealing this secret could upend everything she had ever known, but deep down, she knew she couldn't ignore it either. This revelation was too important. In the following days, Olivia went about her usual chores at the Harrington estate with a new sense of awareness. She studied Mrs. Harrington carefully, noticing every twitch, every fleeting glance, and the way her demeanor shifted whenever Olivia entered the room. Something wasn't right. Mrs. Harrington was always composed, her demeanor cold and distant. Yet now Olivia caught glimpses of nervousness in her eyes, as if the older woman sensed that something was amiss. One afternoon, while dusting the grand piano in the living room, Olivia heard hushed voices from the study. She recognized Mrs. Harrington's sharp, clipped tone speaking urgently to someone on the phone. "I don't care what the records say. No one must find out about Eleanor. It's in the past." Buried. Olivia's heart pounded in her chest as she carefully moved closer to the door, straining to hear more. Mrs. Harrington continued, her voice dripping with anxiety. "I knew this would come back to haunt us. If anyone finds out, it could ruin everything." Olivia's hands clenched around the dust cloth. Mrs. Harrington did know something, and she was terrified of it coming to light. Olivia stepped back quickly before she was noticed, her mind racing. The family she had worked for, the people who had looked down on her, were now the ones hiding in fear of a truth they had buried for years. That night, Olivia sat down with her mother, carefully choosing her words. "Mama," she said softly, unfolding the letter and placing it in front of her. "Did Grandma ever talk about Mr. Harrington?" Her mother's brows furrowed, a mixture of confusion and hesitation crossing her face. "She never said much," she admitted, "but she always had this sadness in her eyes when she spoke about working for the Harringtons. She used to say that love doesn't always mean freedom." Tears welled in Olivia's eyes as she listened, the puzzle pieces beginning to fall into place. "Mama, I think there's more to our history with them than we ever knew," Olivia whispered, pushing the letter gently toward her mother. Her mother read the letter in silence, her hands trembling as she traced the words. When she finished, she looked up at Olivia with wide, stunned eyes. This means we're—" Olivia nodded. "Family," she said, the word tasting foreign yet undeniable. As the days went on, Olivia struggled with the burden of the truth. The more she watched Mrs. Harrington, the more she noticed the subtle tension in the older woman's movements, the tight-lipped responses whenever Eleanor's name was mentioned in passing. Olivia knew the time would come when she would have to confront Mrs. Harrington and demand the truth, but for now, she needed to be smart. Digging deeper into the mansion's attic, Olivia searched through old boxes and forgotten belongings, uncovering old photographs and letters that further confirmed what she had already suspected. In one black-and-white photograph, her grandmother stood beside a young Richard Harrington Sr., their smiles soft, their eyes filled with something deeper than mere employer and employee relations. Holding the photo close to her chest, Olivia knew that the truth had been hidden for too long. It was time to bring it to light, not just for her grandmother's sake, but for her own. Little did she know, the truth she was about to uncover would shake the very foundation of the Harrington household and force Mrs. Harrington to confront the long-buried past she had fought so hard to keep hidden. Olivia stood her ground, her hands clasped tightly in front of her as Mr. Harrington leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the letter as if it were a ghost from his past. The room was thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken truths and long-buried regrets. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Olivia asked, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "Why did my grandmother have to live in silence?" Mr. Harrington ran a shaky hand through his graying hair, his once authoritative presence now diminished by the weight of his confession. "I was just a boy when it all happened," he admitted, his voice low. "My father, he loved Eleanor, but he was too much of a coward to fight for her. He let fear and expectations dictate his life, and when my mother found out, well, you can imagine how that went." Olivia swallowed hard, nodding. She could imagine all too well, given Mrs. Harrington's demeanor. As if on cue, the door to the study burst open, and Mrs. Harrington's sharp heels clicked against the hardwood floor. Her eyes blazed with fury, her lips set in a thin line. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her gaze landing on the letter in Mr. Harrington's trembling hands. When she realized what it was, her face twisted in anger. "This is nonsense," she snapped. "That woman meant nothing to this family. And that letter, it's nothing but sentimental rubbish." Olivia met her gaze, standing tall despite the venom in Mrs. Harrington's tone. "It's not rubbish. It's the truth," Olivia said calmly but firmly. "And I think you've known it all along." Mrs. Harrington's expression faltered for a moment before she regained her composure. "Even if it is true, it doesn't change anything. We gave your grandmother a job, Olivia. We treated her fairly." Her voice was laced with condescension, as if generosity had erased years of secrecy and pain. Mr. Harrington looked up at his wife, his voice steadier than before. "No, Margaret," he said softly but firmly. "It changes everything." Mrs. Harrington's mouth opened in protest, but Mr. Harrington cut her off. "Eleanor wasn't just some employee. She was family, and we ignored her. My father ignored her. And that was wrong." For the first time, Olivia saw a flicker of guilt in Mrs. Harrington's eyes, but it was fleeting. The older woman shook her head, clinging to her pride. "So what now?" she sneered. "Do you want an apology, Olivia? Do you expect us to embrace you like long-lost family? That's not how the world works." Olivia felt the sting of those words, but she refused to let them shake her. "I don't need an apology," she said evenly. "I just needed the truth. For my grandmother, for my mother, and for me." Mr. Harrington stood from his chair, walking over to Olivia with a somber expression. "I can't change the past," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But I want to do something now, Olivia. I want to make things right." Olivia searched his face, trying to discern if his words were sincere. "How?" she asked cautiously. Mr. Harrington sighed. "I want to formally acknowledge what happened. Your grandmother and mother deserve that. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to offer you more than just a job. I'd like to support your future, Olivia." Mrs. Harrington's face paled. "You can't be serious, Richard." But he was. "I am," he said with quiet determination, turning to Olivia. "Your family has given so much to this household, and it's time we gave something back." Olivia felt a lump rise in her throat. For years, she had walked these halls feeling invisible, unwanted. And now, standing here, she realized that her courage had uncovered something deeper than just a hidden letter. It had uncovered the humanity buried beneath years of denial. "I don't want charity," Olivia said after a moment, her voice firm. "But I'll take acknowledgement and respect." Mr. Harrington nodded. "That's more than fair." Mrs. Harrington huffed, turning on her heel and storming out of the study, her heels clicking furiously against the floor. Olivia didn't expect anything less, but it no longer mattered. She had the truth, and she had reclaimed her family's dignity. As she left the study that evening, Olivia felt lighter, as though generations of silence had finally been lifted. She wasn't just a maid in the Harrington household anymore. She was a woman who had confronted the past and demanded to be seen. And for the first time, Mr. Harrington had truly seen her. As the truth unraveled, the Harrington estate buzzed with whispers and uneasy glances. The staff, once indifferent or dismissive toward Olivia, now treated her with cautious curiosity, some offering sympathetic smiles while others avoided eye contact altogether. The town's elite circles, known for their tightly guarded reputations, were abuzz with speculation. "Did you hear?" they whispered at tea parties and charity galas. "The Maid is actually one of them." Olivia, however, refused to let the gossip affect her resolve. She had spent years working quietly in the background, blending into the ornate wallpaper of the Harrington home. But now she was no longer invisible. She carried herself with quiet dignity, determined to face the changing tides head-on. At night, Olivia lay in bed, reflecting on the whirlwind of emotions and changes. She knew that standing up for the truth would never be easy. But deep in her heart, she felt her grandmother's presence, strong, unwavering, and proud. In the end, Olivia realized that the fight wasn't just about inheritance or a name, it was about reclaiming her family's dignity and honoring the legacy of the woman who had sacrificed everything for love, and she wasn't going to let it be forgotten. The grand Harrington estate, once filled with whispers and hidden secrets, now buzzed with an uncomfortable anticipation. Guests gathered in the luxurious drawing room, sipping champagne and exchanging curious glances, unsure of what was about to unfold. Olivia stood near the grand fireplace, holding the fragile letter in her hands, her heart pounding but her resolve stronger than ever. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward, her gaze sweeping across the room. Mr. Harrington, with his head slightly bowed in remorse. Mrs. Harrington, stiff and composed, but unable to hide the tension in her clenched jaw. and the rest of the family and their friends watching with a mix of curiosity and unease. "With your permission, Mr. Harrington," Olivia said, her voice steady but powerful. "I'd like to share something that's long been hidden, something that belongs to my family as much as it does to yours." Mr. Harrington gave a slow nod, his expression solemn. Olivia carefully unfolded the letter and began reading aloud, her voice carrying through the ornate room. "My dearest Eleanor, I never stopped loving you." As she continued, the words spoke of love, heartbreak, and the weight of societal expectations. Olivia felt the emotion in every line, and she saw it reflected in the faces around her, some shocked, others moved, and a few filled with shame. She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "For years, my grandmother's love and sacrifice were buried in silence," Olivia said, her voice filled with quiet strength. "But today, the truth will no longer be hidden. My grandmother deserved more than secrecy. My mother deserved more than silence. And I deserve to be seen for who I am, not just as the help, but as part of a legacy that can no longer be ignored." A hush fell over the room, the truth too powerful to be denied. Mr. Harrington stood up, his voice trembling but firm. "Olivia, I owe you and your family an apology, a public one." He looked around the room, his gaze meeting each pair of eyes. "My father's mistakes and my own ignorance have kept this truth buried for too long. But no more. I intend to ensure that Eleanor's name and the sacrifices she made are recognized and honored." Mrs. Harrington stiffened, but for once she remained silent. She knew she could no longer fight the inevitable. The truth, undeniable and unshakable, had forced her to confront the cracks in the pristine image she had so carefully maintained. Olivia, standing tall and proud, nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington. Acknowledgement means more than anything, and I hope that going forward, this house and this family will stand for honesty and inclusion rather than secrecy and exclusion." The guests murmured in agreement, some offering polite applause, others visibly shaken by the revelations. Olivia felt a sense of triumph, not in seeking validation, but in reclaiming the dignity that had long been denied to her family. In the following weeks, Olivia used her newfound voice to advocate for fairness and equality within the community. She spoke at local events, sharing her story and encouraging others to challenge the divisions that had defined them for so long. What was once a household that had dismissed her presence now had no choice but to recognize her strength, intelligence, and unbreakable spirit. That evening, as Olivia stepped out of the mansion for what felt like the first time as her true self, she looked back at the grand estate with a sense of closure. The past, though painful, had been confronted. The future was hers to shape. With her head held high, she walked forward, no longer just the maid, but a woman who had reclaimed her rightful place in history.